The year was 30 CE, and on the dusty road to Jerusalem, a decision was about to be made that would completely change the course of human history. What you're about to hear is the alternate timeline that almost happened. How Jesus of Nazareth's survival of crucifixion would have created a form of Christianity so radically different that the religion we know today would be unrecognizable, and how this single change would have prevented wars, reshaped empires, and given humanity a completely different relationship with the divine. This isn't speculation about religious doctrine. This is about how one man living to old age instead of dying young would have created a world where East and West never separated, where science and faith developed together, and where the very foundations of Western civilization followed a completely different path. Picture Palestine under Roman occupation. Jesus had been preaching for 3 years, gathering followers who believed he was the promised Messiah, but instead of the crucifixion that would make him a martyr. Imagine if Pontius Pilate had made a different decision. What if political pressure from influential supporters had secured Jesus' release? What if he had lived to continue teaching for another 40 years? The immediate consequences would have been extraordinary. Instead of Christianity being born from the trauma of Jesus' death and the mystery of resurrection, it would have developed as a living tradition guided by its founders' direct teachings. No need for interpretations of what Jesus really meant, because he would still be there to explain it himself. No debates about divine nature, because followers could observe his humanity firsthand. The Jesus who lived to old age would have continued evolving his teachings, responding to new questions, adapting his message to changing circumstances. The Christianity that emerged wouldn't have been frozen in the moment of crucifixion, but would have grown and developed through decades of additional divine guidance, creating a faith that was more flexible, more nuanced, and more responsive to human needs. But perhaps the most revolutionary change would have been in Christianity's relationship with Judaism. Instead of breaking away from Jewish tradition after the crucifixion, a living Jesus would have worked to reform Judaism from within. He had always presented himself as fulfilling rather than replacing Jewish law. With time to develop this vision, he could have created a reformed Judaism that satisfied both traditional believers and his revolutionary followers. This unified Judeo-Christian tradition would have prevented one of history's most tragic divisions. No Christian anti-Semitism born from blaming Jews for crucifixion. No theological separation that painted Judaism as superseded by Christianity. Instead, a reformed Jewish faith that recognized Jesus as Messiah, while maintaining continuity with ancient traditions. The Holocaust might never have happened because the ideological foundations for Christian hatred of Jews would never have been established. The theological implications would have been mind-blowing. Traditional Christian doctrine about Jesus' divine nature was largely developed to explain how a crucified criminal could be the Son of God, but a Jesus who lived to old age wouldn't have required such complex explanations. His teachings and actions over decades would have provided clear evidence of his divine mission, creating a simpler, more accessible faith that didn't require sophisticated theology to understand. Without the crucifixion as Christianity's central event, the religion would have focused on Jesus' teachings rather than his death. The emphasis would have been on living according to divine principles rather than on salvation through sacrifice. This would have created a more practical, ethical form of Christianity that emphasized behavior and character rather than belief and ritual. The political development of Christianity would have been completely different. Instead of spreading as an underground movement among the oppressed, a living Jesus could have engaged directly with Roman authorities. His followers included wealthy and influential people who could have provided protection and legitimacy. Christianity might have become the official religion of Rome through conversion rather than conquest. Emperor Constantine's conversion in 312 CE marked Christianity's transformation from persecuted sect to imperial religion. But if Jesus had lived to old age, so this transition might have happened centuries earlier and much more peacefully. A Jesus who could demonstrate his divine authority to Roman leaders, might have converted the empire through persuasion rather than political convenience. The scientific implications of Jesus' extended life would have been extraordinary. His recorded miracles suggest mastery of natural forces that modern science struggles to explain. 40 additional years of such demonstrations could have accelerated human understanding of physics, medicine, and natural philosophy by centuries. Instead of faith and science developing as opposing forces, they might have evolved together under divine guidance. Jesus' healing abilities, if continued over decades, would have revolutionized ancient medicine. Rather than being dismissed as folklore, his techniques could have been studied, documented, and developed into systematic medical practices. The integration of spiritual and physical healing might have prevented the separation of medicine and religion that characterized later Western development. The social changes would have been equally profound. Jesus' teachings about equality, compassion, and social justice could have been implemented gradually over decades rather than remaining theoretical ideals. With time to work out practical applications, he could have created functioning communities that demonstrated alternative ways of organizing human society. Women's roles in Christianity would have evolved very differently under Jesus' continued guidance. The Gospels show him treating women as equals and including them among his closest followers. 40 years of such leadership could have established patterns of gender equality that would have prevented centuries of religious patriarchy. Christianity might have become a force for women's liberation rather than their oppression. The expansion of Christianity would have followed completely different patterns. Instead of spreading through martyrdom and persecution, it would have grown through the demonstration of practical benefits. Communities following Jesus' teachings would have been more prosperous, healthier, and more peaceful than their neighbors, creating organic growth based on observable results rather than faith in invisible promises. The relationship between Christianity and other religions would have been fundamentally different. A living Jesus could have engaged directly with Buddhist, Hindu, and other spiritual traditions, possibly creating synthetic teachings that combine the best elements of multiple faiths. Instead of Christianity developing in isolation, it might have become part of a global spiritual renaissance. Jesus' engagement with Greek philosophy could have prevented the intellectual conflicts that plagued later Christianity. Instead of early church fathers struggling to reconcile faith with reason, Jesus himself could have demonstrated how divine wisdom and human knowledge complement each other. Philosophy and theology might have developed as allied disciplines rather than competitors. The economic implications would have been revolutionary. Jesus' teachings about wealth, poverty, and social responsibility could have been implemented as practical economic policies. Instead of Christianity accommodating existing power structures, it might have created alternative economic systems based on cooperation rather than competition. The development of capitalism might have been prevented or dramatically modified. The geographic development of Christianity would have been completely different. Instead of the religion's center shifting from Jerusalem to Rome to Constantinople, it might have remained rooted in the Middle East. This could have prevented the East-West schism that divided Christianity, and might have created better relationships between Christian and Islamic civilizations when Islam emerged. The Crusades would never have happened under this alternate timeline, without the theology of holy war that developed from martyrdom traditions. And with Christianity remaining more connected to its Middle Eastern roots, the conflicts between Christian and Muslim civilizations would have been impossible. Instead of religious warfare, there might have been theological dialogue and mutual influence. The development of Christian mysticism would have been extraordinary under Jesus' direct guidance. Instead of mystics struggling to achieve union with the divine through their own efforts, they could have learned directly from someone who embodied divine consciousness. The techniques of spiritual development could have been systematized and taught openly rather than remaining secret knowledge. The role of the church hierarchy would have been completely different. With Jesus present to provide direct guidance, there would have been less need for complex institutional structures to interpret and preserve his teachings. Christianity might have remained more decentralized, democratic, and responsive to local needs, preventing the concentration of power that characterized later church development. The artistic and cultural development influenced by Christianity would have followed different paths. Instead of focusing on images of suffering and martyrdom, Christian art would have celebrated the living presence of divine wisdom. Architecture, music, and literature would have reflected joy and fulfillment rather than sacrifice and redemption. The entire aesthetic foundation of Western civilization would have been different. The preservation of ancient knowledge might have been more successful under Jesus' influence. Instead of early Christians sometimes viewing pagan learning as dangerous, a Jesus who lived to engage with classical philosophy and science might have encouraged the preservation and development of ancient wisdom. The Dark Ages might have been prevented entirely. The development of individual spirituality would have been fundamentally different. Instead of people needing intermediaries to access divine wisdom, they could have learned directly from Jesus how to develop their own spiritual capabilities. This might have created a more mature, self-reliant form of religiosity that emphasized personal development rather than institutional dependence. Modern Christianity's social and political positions might have been completely different. Issues like slavery, women's rights, environmental stewardship, and economic justice could have been addressed definitively by Jesus himself, rather than being left to later interpretation. This could have prevented centuries of Christian support for social systems that contradicted the religion's fundamental values. The relationship between Christianity and secular government would have evolved differently. Instead of the complex negotiations between church and state that characterized later history, Jesus' continued presence might have created clear principles for the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. Theocracy and secularism might both have been unnecessary concepts. Today, in 2024, we might be living in a world where humanity had achieved spiritual maturity under centuries of divine guidance, where science and religion worked together to solve human problems, where different cultures had learned to cooperate rather than compete, where individual potential was developed through proven spiritual techniques rather than left to chance. The next time someone suggests that history was inevitable, remember that Jesus' crucifixion was a political decision that could have gone differently. One man's survival could have changed everything, creating a world where humanity developed its highest potential under divine guidance rather than struggling alone through centuries of conflict and confusion. If alternate histories and the moments that shaped our spiritual development fascinate you, subscribe to the Gray Hour for more explorations of how different choices could have created completely different realities. Because understanding the paths we didn't take helps us appreciate the extraordinary significance of the choices that determine our actual history.